Eric Clapton was signing guitars after the 2004 Crossroads auction when a man handed him a 1956 Stratocaster. "This isn't mine to sign," Clapton said. "It's yours," the man replied. "I stole it from your dressing room in 1964. I've lived with the guilt for 40 years. I just paid nearly $1 million to give it back." What happened next proved that some sins take a lifetime to confess. It was June 24, 2004, at the Crossroads Center benefit auction in New York City's prestigious Christie's auction house. Eric Clapton had organized the auction to raise money for his rehab facility in Antigua, the place that had saved countless lives since he'd founded it in 1998. Clapton knew what addiction looked like. He'd battled alcohol, cocaine, and heroin for decades. Getting sober in 1987 had saved his life. Now, 17 years later, he was using his fame and his guitarist to save others. The auction featured over 70 guitars from Clapton's personal collection, vintage Fenders, rare Gibsons, custom-made instruments that had been with him through decades of performances. Each guitar had a story. Each had been played on stages around the world, and now each would be sold to raise money for people fighting the same demons Clapton had fought. Among the guitars up for auction was a 1956 Fender Stratocaster, lot number 37. Sunburst finish that had aged beautifully over 48 years. Maple neck with wear marks where countless hands had gripped it. Original pickups that still hummed with vintage tone. The auction catalog described it as recovered from a private collection, authenticated and verified as Clapton's personal instrument from 1963 to 1964. What the catalog didn't say was that this guitar had been stolen. In August 1964, it had disappeared from Clapton's dressing room at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, London. Clapton had been on stage performing with the Yardbirds, his first major band, the group that had launched his career. When he returned to the dressing room after the show, the guitar was gone, just vanished. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, just an empty guitar case and a sick feeling in Clapton's stomach. At 19 years old, losing that guitar had devastated Clapton. He'd filed a police report, the band had questioned the venue staff, but the guitar never turned up. Eventually, Clapton had to accept it was gone and move on. He bought another Stratocaster and continued his career. Within a few years, he'd become famous enough that one stolen guitar seemed like a minor footnote in a legendary career. But 40 years later, in 2004, that guitar had mysteriously resurfaced. Clapton's team didn't question it too deeply. Vintage instruments reappeared all the time, surfacing from estate sales, forgotten collections, storage units. The guitar had been authenticated by experts who verified it was indeed the instrument Clapton had owned in 1964. The serial numbers matched. The wear patterns matched Clapton's playing style. It was the real thing. So the guitar was added to the auction, expected to fetch somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000. The bidding started at $100,000. Within the first 2 minutes, it climbed to $300,000. A known collector from Texas, a man who owned over 200 vintage guitars, was bidding aggressively. But he wasn't alone. An unknown bidder, participating by phone, matched him dollar for dollar. $400,000, $500,000. The auctioneer's voice grew more excited. This was becoming one of the highest prices ever paid for a Clapton guitar. $600,000, $700,000. The Texas collector was sweating now, starting to doubt whether he should continue, but he pushed on. $800,000. The phone bidder countered immediately, $850,000. The Texas collector hesitated. That was already more than he'd planned to spend. He looked around the room, trying to see if he could identify his competitor, but phone bidders were anonymous, their identities known only to the auction house staff. $900,000.
The phone bidder responded without hesitation, $950,000. The Texas collector shook his head and sat down. He was out. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Sold to the phone bidder, $959,500. The room erupted in applause. It was the third highest price ever paid for a guitar at that point. The auction house staff was ecstatic. Clapton himself, sitting in the audience, was amazed. He'd expected the guitar to do well, but nearly $1 million? That was extraordinary. That money would fund treatment for dozens of people at Crossroads Center. But while everyone else celebrated, the winning bidder, listening on the phone from a small office in Manchester, England, hung up and immediately ran to the bathroom to vomit. Not from excitement, from terror. His name was David Thompson. He was 52 years old. He owned a small plumbing business that employed 6 people. He lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with his wife Rachel and their 12-year-old son Michael. He was not wealthy. The most expensive thing he'd ever bought before this moment was his house, which had cost £90,000 20 years ago.
To afford the $959,000 bid, David had done something insane. He'd taken out a second mortgage on his house. He'd emptied his retirement account. He'd borrowed money from his brother. He'd sold his car and bought a cheaper used one. And he still didn't have enough, so he'd taken out a personal loan at a devastating interest rate. His wife Rachel had discovered what he was doing 3 days before the auction. She'd found the bank statements, the loan applications, the second mortgage paperwork. They'd had the worst fight of their 20-year marriage. "You're going to bankrupt us," Rachel had screamed. "For a guitar? Have you lost your mind?" David couldn't explain it to her. How could he tell her that he wasn't buying a guitar? He was buying redemption. How could he tell her that for 40 years he'd been living with a secret that was eating him alive? So he'd simply said, "I have to do this. I can't explain why, but I have to. Please trust me." Rachel hadn't trusted him. She'd threatened to leave. She'd packed a bag and gone to stay with her sister. She'd told David that when this insanity was over, they'd need to have a serious conversation about their marriage. But David had proceeded anyway, because the guilt, the crushing, suffocating guilt that he'd carried since he was 12 years old, was worse than bankruptcy, worse than divorce, worse than anything. 3 days after winning the auction, David flew to New York. He'd never been to America before. He checked into a cheap hotel in Queens, took the subway to Manhattan, and walked into Christie's auction house to claim his guitar. The staff treated him like a celebrity. "Mr. Thompson, congratulations on your winning bid. What an incredible guitar. Mr. Clapton is here today signing the guitars for winning bidders. You'll get to meet him." David felt like he might faint. He'd known Clapton would be there. That was part of why he'd bid. But now that the moment was here, David wasn't sure he could go through with it. He was led to a private reception room where other winning bidders were mingling, holding their newly acquired guitars, taking photos, celebrating. Champagne was being served. People were laughing, excited, showing off their purchases. David stood in the corner, clutching the 1956 Stratocaster case, trying to control his breathing. His hands were shaking so badly that the case rattled. A staff member approached. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Clapton is ready to sign your guitar. Come this way." David followed, his legs barely working. He felt like he was walking to his own execution. And then, suddenly, there he was, Eric Clapton, 69 years old, gray hair, kind eyes, relaxed smile, sitting at a table, chatting warmly with a collector, signing a beautiful sunburst Telecaster. When it was David's turn, Clapton looked up and smiled. "Hello, you must be David Thompson, the $959,000 man. That was quite a bidding war."
David managed to croak out, "Yes, sir, that's me." "Please, call me Eric. Let's see this guitar." David set the case on the table. His hands fumbled with the latches. It took him 3 tries to open it. When he finally got it open, there it was. The 1956 Stratocaster, sunburst finish glowing in the reception room lights. Beautiful, timeless, priceless. Clapton leaned forward, admiring it. God, look at that! Still beautiful after all these years. I played some great shows with this guitar. The Crawdaddy Club, the Marquee, the 100 Club. This guitar was with me when I was just starting to figure out who I was as a player. He reached for it. Where would you like me to sign? Usually people want it on the body, right here below the pickguard, or on the back of the headstock. David's voice came out strangled. You can't sign it. Clapton paused, his hand hovering over the guitar. I'm sorry? You can't sign it because it's not mine to sign. Clapton looked confused. I don't understand. You bought it. You own it now. That's how this works. David closed his eyes. His whole body was trembling. He'd rehearsed this moment 10,000 times in his head, but now that it was here, the words wouldn't come. Mr. Clapton, Eric, I need to tell you something, and you're going to hate me for it, but I've waited 40 years to say this, and I can't wait any more. Clapton sat back, reading the intensity on David's face. The room had grown quieter. People nearby had stopped talking, sensing something important was happening. All right, Clapton said gently. Tell me. David opened his eyes. Tears were already forming. My name is David Thompson. I grew up in Richmond, near the Crawdaddy Club. In 1964, I was 12 years old. I was obsessed with the Yardbirds, obsessed with you. You were my hero. I'd seen you play at the Crawdaddy 6 times. My parents thought I was at the library, but I'd sneak to the club and watch through the back door. Clapton nodded, listening. On August 15th, 1964, I snuck into the venue early, before the show. The backstage door was unlocked. I just walked in. I told myself I just wanted to see the dressing room, see where you prepared. But then I saw your guitar, this guitar, sitting in its case, and I couldn't help myself. I thought if I had your guitar, I could play like you. I thought I'd just borrow it, maybe for a few days, then I'd return it somehow. David's voice broke. But I didn't return it. I took it home. I hid it in my closet, and when I saw the news that it had been stolen, that you'd filed a police report, I panicked. I couldn't return it then. You'd know it was me. I'd go to jail. So I kept it, and days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, years into decades, and I've had this guitar for 40 years. The room was completely silent now. Every single person was staring. Clapton sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. David continued, tears streaming down his face. I learned to play on this guitar. It's the only guitar I've ever owned. Every day for 40 years I've picked it up and played it and felt the guilt crushing me. Because it wasn't mine. I stole it. From you, from my hero. And I've lived with that shame every single day. David took a shuddering breath. Last week, my son, Michael, he's 12, the same age I was. I caught him stealing a candy bar from a store, just a stupid candy bar, and I yelled at him. I told him stealing was wrong, and he looked at me and said, "But why is it wrong?" And I realized I couldn't teach him that stealing is wrong when I've been living with a stolen guitar for 40 years. David wiped his eyes. So I told him what I did. I told him everything, and I told him I was going to make it right. When I saw you were auctioning guitars for Crossroads, I knew this was my chance. The money would help people, and I could give back what I stole. So I mortgaged my house, I emptied my savings, I borrowed money I can't pay back, and I bid $959,000 for a guitar that was already mine, because it was never mine. It was always yours." David looked directly at Clapton. "Mr. Clapton, I stole your guitar in 1964. I've had it for 40 years, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've come here to give it back to you and ask if you can ever forgive me." The silence that followed felt eternal. Clapton stared at David, then at the guitar, then back at David. Finally, Clapton spoke, his voice soft. "You were 12 years old?" "Yes, sir." "And you've carried this guilt for 40 years?" "Every day." "You could have sold this guitar any time. It would have been worth a fortune, even 20 years ago. But you didn't." "I couldn't. It wasn't mine to sell." Clapton stood up slowly. He walked around the table and stood directly in front of David. For a moment, David thought Clapton might hit him. He would have deserved it.
Instead, Clapton did something David never expected. He pulled David into a hug. "Thank you," Clapton said quietly. "Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for teaching me something I'd forgotten." David sobbed into Clapton's shoulder. 40 years of guilt releasing all at once. The room full of people watched, many of them crying too. When Clapton finally released David, he kept his hands on David's shoulders. "David, let me tell you something. I've done things in my life I'm not proud of. I've hurt people. I've lied. I've stolen. Maybe not guitars, but I've taken things that weren't mine to take. I spent years addicted to drugs and alcohol, destroying everything around me. And the only reason I'm standing here today is because people forgave me, because people gave me second chances I didn't deserve." Clapton picked up the guitar. "This guitar was stolen from me 40 years ago. And yes, it hurt. But you know what hurt more? My addiction. Losing my son, destroying my relationships. This guitar? This is just wood and metal and wire. But you're a human being who made a mistake when you were a child and has spent 40 years trying to make it right. That takes more courage than I've ever had." He handed the guitar to David. "This guitar is yours, David. You've earned it. Not by stealing it, but by having the conscience to return it. The $959,000 you paid goes to Crossroads. That money will save lives. Your guilt has been transformed into healing for others. That's redemption." David shook his head. "I can't accept this. I stole it. I need to give it back." "And you have given it back. By buying it at auction, by confessing, by teaching your son that it's never too late to do the right thing. You've given me back more than a guitar. You've given me faith in humanity." Clapton pulled out a Sharpie. "Now, let me sign this thing properly." He turned the guitar over and wrote on the back, "To David Thompson, who taught me that conscience is worth more than any guitar, who waited 40 years to do the right thing, who proved that guilt can be transformed into grace. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your courage. Play this guitar without shame. You've earned it. Eric Clapton, June 27, 2004. Clapton handed the guitar back to David. Then he called out, "Is Michael here, David's son?" A young boy emerged from the back of the room. Michael Thompson, 12 years old, nervous and proud in equal measure.
Clapton crouched down to Michael's eye level. "Michael, your dad did something extraordinary today. He made a mistake 40 years ago, and he just spent everything he has to make it right. Most people would have kept the secret forever, but your dad chose courage over comfort. Do you understand how rare that is?" Michael nodded, tears in his eyes. "I want you to remember this day," Clapton continued. "Remember that it's never too late to do the right thing, and remember that your dad loves you enough to mortgage his house and risk everything to teach you that lesson. That's what real love looks like."
Clapton stood and shook David's hand. "Play that guitar, David. Make music with it. And every time you pick it up, remember that you're forgiven." The story should have ended there, but Eric Clapton couldn't let it go. Over the next week, he thought constantly about David Thompson, about a 12-year-old boy making a mistake, about 40 years of guilt, about a man willing to bankrupt himself for redemption. 1 week after the auction, David received a FedEx package at his home in Manchester. Inside was a check for $959,500 made out to David Thompson. The note with it read, "David, I've thought about nothing but our conversation for the past week, and I've come to a decision. Your punishment was 40 years of guilt. That's enough, more than enough. No human being should carry that weight for that long. The money you paid at auction still goes to Crossroads Center. That money will still save lives. Your redemption still happens. But I'm refunding your payment because I believe you've already paid the highest price, 40 years of your conscience. Use this money to pay off your mortgage, take your wife on a vacation, invest in your son's education, and play that guitar without guilt. You don't owe me anything anymore. You never really did. You were a child who made a mistake. I'm a man who's made countless mistakes. We're even. Thank you for reminding me that forgiveness isn't something we earn, it's something we give and receive. Your friend, Eric."
David Thompson tried to refuse the check. He called Clapton's management repeatedly, but Clapton's answer was always the same. He carried his guilt for 40 years. That's penance enough. Now he gets to live free. Today, David Thompson is 62 years old. He still owns that 1956 Stratocaster. It hangs in his living room, Clapton's signature clearly visible. Collectors have offered him over $2 million for it. David always refuses. "It's not for sale," David says. "It cost me 40 years of guilt, $959,000, and my pride. But Eric Clapton taught me that forgiveness is worth more than any guitar." Michael Thompson, who watched his father confess, is now 32. He's a teacher. Every year he tells his students his father's story. And Eric Clapton still talks about David Thompson in interviews. "David taught me that conscience is more valuable than any guitar, and that real forgiveness means giving people back more than they took from you." A guitar stolen in 1964, returned in 2004, forgiven immediately. Because some sins take 40 years to confess, and some forgiveness takes only a moment to give.